9, Big 550, KTRS. Welcome back. Wednesday morning. Martin Kilcoyne comes your way 1 hour from now here on the Big 550, KTRS. And late last week, there was a story. KMOV had a story in which Tishaura Jones, who is the treasurer in the city of St. Louis, took a number of trips, some 50 trips while she was treasurer, many of them paid for by taxpayers, and they were calling into question the veracity of those and how much of that actually had to do with her job. Post-Dispatch did a follow-up story that was posted yesterday. We've asked Tishaura Jones to come on the show, and so Jared Boyd, Chief of Staff to Treasurer Tishaura Jones, joins us. Jared Boyd, welcome to Big 550 KTRS.
Thank you for having me this morning.
You got it. Now, just so we understand this, she's a treasurer, but she's running for mayor. You're her chief of staff for her treasurer role.
That's correct. And these trips happened as...
Well, hold on a second. But
yes.
I want to understand where you are. Do you work for the campaign? Or do you
I do not work for the campaign. I work in the office.
You work for the office.
Correct.
Okay. First question is, why are you here and not Tishaura Jones?
Well, I'm here because, one, I work in the office and have an understanding as to what our office does and the context for those trips, and reached out to try and hopefully provide some context for those trips, because we expect the press to provide context for what our office does and how these trips relate to that. And we just hope to start a conversation as to what our office has done and look forward to having that conversation.
Certainly understandable.
Sure.
And we take all comers from all sides. We ask the question, and we shut up and we let them answer.
Sure.
But Tishaura Jones is the one who's been called on the carpet on this. That's the allegations are for her. So why isn't she here? Why are you here speaking for her as opposed to her being here speaking for herself?
I think she is comfortable speaking for herself, but time is certainly limited. She has to devote a lot of time to running for mayor, whereas I feel as if I can actually talk about what our office has done, because that is where I've worked, and understand the connectedness between what our office does and how these trips save the city of St. Louis money and improve services.
You understand, though, by she not coming here, some people might think doesn't want to answer the questions or trying to duck the questions, right? If somebody were accusing me of something, you'd want to sing from the highest mountaintop, hey, wait a minute, I'm innocent of this, right? So by the chief of staff coming sort of calls into question, why isn't she here?
I don't know if that's the case, McGraw. I would also point to the fact that on our website, we've listed every single trip and the rationale behind every single trip. So we are devoted to being transparent about this, and like I said, talking about why these trips have been helpful to the city of St. Louis and the small investment that has led to savings and improvements in services.
Okay, so it isn't that she has a problem with me?
No, not at all.
Because she's been on the show a couple of times talking about parking and parking studies and everything else.
Yes.
Just as long as she doesn't have a problem with me.
You're great.
All right. I have enough elected officials who have problems with me. All right, Jared Boyd, Chief of Staff to the Treasurer of Tishaura Jones. 50 trips in 4 years. Certainly seems like a lot of trips.
So let's start with what the treasurer actually does, and that is something that I think sometimes gets lost with the news. When she ran for the first time in 2012, the treasurer was responsible primarily for parking and, to a lesser extent, investments for the city and cash management. She ran on expanding the scope of the office to also deal with financial empowerment, and she won and started the Office of Financial Empowerment from scratch. Some people might think that helping people make better decisions with their money isn't a traditional government power, but places like San Francisco and Chicago have opened these offices of financial empowerment because wealth really drives outcomes for folks. So if you're able to save more money, it's better for your city. If you're able to avoid payday lenders, it helps people make better decisions. So these small interventions in terms of helping people improve their credit score, which they can do for free in City Hall in our office, those type of small interventions can go a long way.
So why do you have to go to Paris to do that?
So the Paris trip actually was on the treasurer's own dime, and we put out an RFP to improve parking. I remember we had a conversation. You'd gone to Louisville and paid for parking with a credit card,
right,
and come back to St. Louis and wondered why you couldn't do that here. We put out an RFP to make sure that folks like yourself could get parking with your credit card or phone app. And as a part of that process, we selected a vendor that manufactures parking meters in France. Treasurer paid for her own trip to go to France to actually inspect the meetings after the contract was signed.
Right, but so this company in Paris was a vendor. Why are we going to Paris? Why wasn't the Paris vendor coming to St. Louis? We're buying their materials. Why do we have to go to Paris? They're making money off of us. They should come to us and show us their stuff.
Sure. They've been to St. Louis on more than one occasion. One. Two, when the treasurer went to Paris, she actually went on her own dime to go to the plant where the meters were manufactured, just to learn more about the process. She wanted to be absolutely certain about how these meters worked before we made a significant investment in them.
The St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported that on that Paris trip that, as you say, she paid on her own dime, they say that she put in for a reimbursement for cab rides to and from the hotel. If she paid for her own trip, why would she then want to be reimbursed for a cab ride?
So there probably needs to be a clarification with the Post-Dispatch. There was a trip, or the cab rides took place in New York. There was a meeting with another contractor in New York, so those cab rides occurred between the airport and the New York appointment/meeting. So
gotcha. So they were not part of the Paris trip.
There were no taxpayer or city funds expended in Paris.
Right. If you're arguing that the Paris trip was to see the manufacturer of these machines, was it a work trip or was it not a work trip? If she paid for it on her own dime, so I'm going on vacation to New York. While I'm there, I'll talk to a talk radio guy and I'll call it a business trip. Or I don't understand. Was this Paris trip a business trip or was it a personal trip that she just, while they're there, hey, I'm hanging out here, I'll go talk to this company that I'm talking to?
I think if you go to Paris on your own dime, hopefully you get a chance to see some of the sites. But no city funds were spent in sending her to Paris, but she just felt it was important to learn as much as she could about the manufacturing process for those parking meters before they came to St. Louis. There have been other cities that have purchased these type of parking meters, not this particular vendor's parking meters,
right,
that have not worked or have problems in inclement weather. So the last thing that we would want to do is spend $5 million on new meters that don't work. So she said, I'm going to spend my own money to make sure that these meters work and learn more about them by going to the actual plant where they were manufactured.
Jared Boyd is our guest, Chief of Staff to Tishaura Jones, who has been criticized by a number of media stories, one from KMOV last week and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about the number of trips she has taken as treasurer. She's now running for mayor of St. Louis. Now, we had President of the Board of Aldermen, Louis Reed, on the other day, who was also running for mayor. He's taken one or two trips. The last treasurer took one or two trips. Seems like I don't think anyone's begrudging an elected official taking a trip to find out how Louisville's doing it or New York or whatever else. But 50 trips in 4 years seems a bit excessive.
I would, like I said, go back to the context for what our office does. We helped start an Office of Financial Empowerment from scratch. So the treasurer took it upon herself to go to several conferences and work with several organizations to gather best practices nationwide on how to deal with financial empowerment. So a lot of the trips, have been offset by travel scholarships from some of the conferences, over half of those trips. But a lot of them deal with starting this new Office of Financial Empowerment that as a result of a lot of these conferences and other technical assistance, we're able to give kids who are kindergartners now $50 college savings accounts for any kindergartner in a St. Louis public or charter school. and we're also able to give those kids additional incentives for good behavior, good attendance, and other great factors. And that could not have occurred without national partnerships and best practices. We're also able, in our Office of Financial Empowerment, to help people clean up their credit score, have a budget coach, and offer a whole host of services that in some parts are actually funded through charitable dollars or other national organizations. So we're saving the city money. You've got someone in City Hall who can help you with your credit and other things that's not paid for by city dollars, that's paid for as a result of making connections with national service providers and other entities.
No, I don't think anyone would argue that teaching young children in the inner city about the value of money and how to save and financial literacy is probably one of the most important things to empower them to bring them out of poverty. But again, the criticism is the 50 trips.
Sure.
You can learn that on this trip or that trip or a phone call or a conversation or a conference call or a FaceTime or whatever. The trips is the crux of the story. Understand going to Atlanta for a convention or New York or maybe even to Paris, but seems like 50 trips just seems to be excessive.
I think, like I said, if you don't provide the context, one, for what our office does, but then also how the trips have helped our office. If you go to our website, you can look at the list of trips, and you can also look at the rationale behind the trip. And make your own determination in conjunction with what our office does and has done for the city. We've saved $6.5 million through various refinancings and other efficiencies that we found in the office. And like I said, we have started an Office of Financial Empowerment from scratch. And a lot of those accomplishments could not have occurred without learning nationwide best practices and being able to connect with other entities on a national level. We're going to start a partnership with Duke University on youth savings. They're going to connect us with behavioral scientists and economists to come up with ways in which we can increase the amount of money that kids save with cutting edge research. So, like I said, being able to not just talk about the trip, but being able to talk about how this is going to help St. Louis is, I think, important for the conversation.
Jared Boyd, Chief of Staff to Tishaura Jones. Did she go alone on these trips?
Did she go alone on these trips?
Right. Was she alone? Was she a one person, or did a contingent from the office go?
It would depend on the trip. For the International Parking Institute trips, I believe there were other people in the office that attended because there are programs that help garage managers and other office staff people. But for the vast majority of her trips, she, I think, was by herself.
Did you ever take any of these trips with her?
I did attend a trip to the Chicago Treasurer's Office. We did a site visit to learn how they actually run the investment portion of their office.
And that's the only trip you've been on with her?
I would have to go back and look. Off the top of my head, I may have attended a trip with her other than that, but that is the one that comes to mind right now.
Okay, so do you know you were on one other, two other? I mean, I don't necessarily need you to have dates and travel vouchers, but do you remember how many trips you were on with her as her Chief of Staff?
I can't think of a number offhand right now.
So it might have been others?
Perhaps.
Was it like 10, or was it one or two others?
No,
or
probably a few others, less than 3 or 4.
But you're saying other people in the office also took some of these trips?
Only with her, other people in the office have taken trips. For instance, we have accountants that go to conferences.
Are those records readily available if somebody wants to look at?
We can certainly provide those records.
Okay.
Certainly. And as I said, all of the trips that the treasurer has taken, those trips are documented on our website.
Gotcha. She said yesterday that she alluded to that this was somewhat of a political witch hunt yesterday. Expound on that. Do you really think she's being picked on, or the media is sort of picking on her?
I think that, as I said, it would be helpful if the media provided context for these stories. The sheer volume of stories is probably not helpful. imbalanced in regards to the 11 candidates in the mayoral field. We have seen a disproportionate number of stories that have been devoted to the treasurer. The first story came from the Post-Dispatch and it portrayed the treasurer as someone who has given a contract or a favor to someone connected with her father. Backstory, underwriter, investment bank helped the city save $4.5 million in a refinancing. That bank has hired someone that is connected to Tishaura's father, Vervis Jones, and the inference from the Post-Dispatch story was that there was some cronyism that led to us selecting this bank to save the city $4.5 million.
Right.
When in fact, the Post failed to report that the same bank has worked on 10 deals in Missouri in last year. Only one of those was in the treasurer's office. So St. Louis County, St. Peters, Columbia, the state of Missouri have all used this same bank for either refinancings or bond issuances. And those type of facts, I think, were left out and kind of shed light on the fact that there was really no wrongdoing at play in that story.
Do you think either KMOV or the Post-Dispatch, KMOV, who originally broke the story, or the Post story yesterday, has some agenda in this, or is just, I mean, do you think they're carrying the water for another candidate, or is it just unfortunate that they were unable to tell the full story?
I think it's unfortunate that they're unable to tell the full story, and the process by which they get these stories usually comes from other candidates or opposition research, and those news entities have some obligation to fact check the opposition research that comes in, or, as I said, provide some context for that research.
Do these entities not call you or Ms. Jones for a comment or to explain some of these things?
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And with the news, they can edit stories how they see fit.
Yeah, well. All right, Jared Boyd is with us, Chief of Staff to Tishaura Jones. One last time I'm going to ask you this question. So the transformation of parking meters.
Sure.
I've been in St. Louis long enough to know that I remember Larry Williams, the old treasurer, and the parking meters, and living in the city, and you got to plug it and plug it back. And so this transformation from the nickels and the dimes and the quarters to the debit cards and the swipes and everything else. Clayton's doing it. Other places are doing it. You don't hear the Clayton treasurer or the mayor taking these enormous amounts of trips to switch over. So one more time, I'm going to ask you, these 50 trips were needed to what? What was, I understand one or two or three of them, but 4 or 5, 6. 50 trips in 4 years to bring financial education to some students and to switch the parking meters over from nickels and dimes to debit cards.
And increase investments for the city, increase our return on investments for the city of St. Louis, which we've done. But as I stated before, the bulk of the trips were devoted to helping establish the Office of Financial Empowerment from scratch, or they were leadership development trips that were in large part subsidized by the sponsoring organization.
And everything, all those trips are online?
They are. We're transparent. As I said, we have no problems with people asking questions, or the press, or any taxpayer asking questions. We just want to provide the full story, and we thank you, McGraw, for giving us some opportunity to shed light on these events.
Jared Boyd, Chief of Staff to Tishaura Jones. She's always welcome here. She can certainly come on and anytime and tell us her side of the story. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
928, Big 550, KTRS. Let me tell you about Johnny Londoff Chevrolet, because if you need a vehicle, you need Johnny Londoff.